Good afternoon, and welcome to the latest lecture of the World War II Discussion Forum's Winter and Spring Series. I'm Greg McNiff, the founder and executive director of the group. Thrilled to have today's speaker. Before I introduce him, I want to briefly cover the usual housekeeping items. First, our speaker has graciously agreed to take questions after his prepared remarks. You have two ways to ask a question. You can either use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and I will read out your question to our speaker, or if you prefer to ask your question directly, please use the raise hand feature at the bottom of your screen, and I will call on you to unmute your line. Regardless of the method, please be respectful of our speaker in the audience when asking your question. We'll take about 20 or 30 minutes of Q&A and go to about 2 p.m. New York time. Second, donations are always appreciated. There's a donate tab on the website. Third, we now have a YouTube channel. Please see the icon at the top of the website to access it. And as I mentioned at the beginning, we will be recording this talk for that channel. Fourth and finally, you can send any feedback to the website at wwiidf.org. Now to this afternoon's speaker. Marc Milner is Emeritus Professor of History at the University of New Brunswick and former director of the Gregg Center for the Study of War and Society. He is the author of 10 acclaimed books, including Stopping the Panzers and Battle of the Atlantic. This afternoon, Marc will discuss his latest book, Second Front, Anglo-American Rivalry and the Hidden Story of the Normandy Campaign, which offers a new account of the Second World War and how bitter competition between the Allies would shape the post-war world. Not surprisingly, the reviews have been top shelf. The Wall Street Journal concluding, this is an enlightening study of Anglo-American relations during the 1944 Normandy Campaign. Times Literary Supplement noting this is an extremely important and engaging book. It deserves to be widely read by all World War II scholars. And John McManus, a friend of our group here, writes, with the publication of this fascinating, deeply researched, insightful book, Marc Milner firmly places himself at the very top rank of Normandy historians, and he may well have permanently revised our view of this uniquely iconic battle. I couldn't have said it better. It is a great read and worth the time, and we're thrilled to have Marc. And with that, I will turn it over to him.
Thanks, Greg, and thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to your group and to go online and say a little bit of something. As you mentioned, I do have a few prepared remarks. I wanted to say something about the background, and for people who haven't read the book, a little bit of something about the meat and potatoes of it, for want of a better way of describing it. Those who will have followed my earlier career, and people at NIMAS, perhaps, although I spoke to them years ago about the Normandy campaign, will know that I cut my teeth as a naval historian, and I still have an abiding interest in the Battle of the Atlantic. But the campaign in Normandy has been something I've lived with all my life. My father landed in the assault wave on D-Day, and if I can tell you exactly where he landed, I was there with him in 1993. It's where the Cross of Lorraine has been erected on the beach at Courcelles-sur-Mer, where the Royal Winnipeg Rifles landed, and my father was with the artillery group that was supporting them and the other members of their brigade. So my father, who was a classic Depression era kid, got as far as grade 6, ended up being raised by relatives and kind of living a wayward life. Read continuously about his experience in the war, and when I became a professional historian, the questioning was almost relentless about, why did we do this? Why didn't we do that? Why didn't we do something else? Have you read this? And when we cleaned out their home after my parents died, we found a huge cardboard box filled with dusty and moldy paperbacks. Every book on the Second World War that he could find that had been printed in a format that he could afford to buy had been purchased and read, and I read many of them as a kid. So I've been living with this really all my life. I also spent much of 33 years as an academic teaching military history. Although I wrote naval history, I wrote naval history for the Canadian Armed Forces and the official history of the RCN and some of the Air Force history. Most of my teaching as an academic was on military history, pretty hardcore green stuff. And in fact, where I teach is just a few miles away from Canada's principal training base, where the Army has its core schools for infantry, artillery, armor, and combat engineers. And so a lot of my students who were uniformed were Army students, and we spent a lot of time dealing with the Army. So I did one thing as an historian and kind of lived this alternate life as someone who taught Army history and supervised Army graduate students, and did a lot of of the theses that I supervised were actually on the Northwest Europe campaign in one form or another. So I came into this, I think, quite honestly, even while I was working as a naval historian. I also picked up the habit of fairly early on of doing battlefield study tours. I did my first to Italy in 1984 with my mentor, Toby Graham, here at the University of New Brunswick. I was actually working for the Department of National Defense at the time, and we took a group of sailors, as it turns out, to tour the Gothic Line in northern Italy, and that was my first encounter of trying to reconcile what I book learned to the ground, and it was a revelatory experience. Almost nothing that I thought I knew or understood about the way the battle had been conducted survived contact with actually seeing the ground and having it explained to me by people who had been there, in the case of Toby Graham. 1993, I went to Europe with my father and with Toby Graham, and I actually followed my father's footsteps and stood on the beach where he had landed, and that simply reaffirmed my belief that people who haven't seen the ground have difficulty making sense out of the battles they write about. And then in 1996, I started doing tours for the Canadian Battlefields Foundation, primarily in the Normandy area, but also Northwest Europe. And they very kindly over the years allowed me to expand the scope of the Canadian tours. And we always ended up in British and American battlefields and cemeteries. So it became a quest of kind of understanding how Canada fits into the story and what the bigger story was, and looking at the ground critically and discovering that the account in the book makes no sense if you stand on that spot because you can't see that spot from there. So from the outset, it was clear to me that the literature probably would never survive contact with the ground. So get the maps out, get the reports out, the war diaries, the aerial photographs, the traces, and start working it up again. So when I started picking it apart in the 1990s, I discovered that not only were a lot of the secondary sources a little bit adrift, a lot of the narratives that had been prepared by the Canadian Army historians in particular during the Second World War, which are incidentally are available online and are a remarkable source, CMHQ and AHQ narratives, often told a different story from what the Canadian official history recorded. In part, I think, because the actual Canadian volume on the Victory campaign, which covers Normandy and Northwest Europe, was written by an aspiring young historian named Reg Roy, who had actually fought in Italy and had no experience of Northwest Europe, and he was a bit under the gun and produced an account which doesn't stand up to the rigor, if you like, of not only the CMHQ and AHQ narratives, but then it doesn't survive contact with the documents that survive in the archives, in part probably because Reg Roy never had access to British or American sources. He would have seen only the limited documents available to him in the Canadian archives. And as I will mention, Canadians did not have access to the key planning documents or the deception files of Operation Overlord. So of necessity, the Canadian account of their own experiences in Normandy is bound to be a little bit less than adequate. So I began to think that if all these problems are manifest in the Canadian account, and Stacy's history of the Victory campaign, the history of Northwest Europe and the Normandy campaign has often been lauded as one of the most critical and best of the available Allied official histories. If Stacy was adrift, what else is adrift? How did we get to this narrative, which every time I pick it apart, every time I stand on the battlefield, every time I look at a book, just doesn't hold up? So about the year 2000, it became something of a quest. I just got the sense that what I was reading was not quite how it went down. And so I basically launched almost a 25-year research project while I did other things. And what I did right from the get-go was try to master the literature. And fortunately, excellent books kept emerging. But I went back to the Green series, to Blumenson and Harrison. I went back to Ellis, the British official history, and literally read them close and took extensive notes and tried to reconcile those. I did a deep dive into the archives in the US, Britain, and Canada to look at some of the key documents and try to push the story back, but also look at some of the documents on the people who wrote the history, who recorded the history at the time as war reporters, and some of the reflective stuff after the war, much of which is in the Liddell Hart Center in London. And then in the process, while doing all this, I made repeated trips to Normandy on behalf of the Canadian Battlefields Foundation, Canadian Armed Forces, the U.S. World War II Museum, my own university. I kept going back, and every time I went back, I would try to build in a little side trip to figure out why that doesn't square with the ground. And so I used the ground itself as much as I possibly could to try to figure out what the hell was going on. So my assumption fairly quickly was that there was probably a problem with what you might call we call a dialectic. There was an expectation of how Normandy was supposed to go down. They're supposed to go according to the plan, right? Montgomery is alleged to have deviated from the plan. So there obviously was a plan, the Cossack plan, and there was an expectation that this is how the battle should go. And then Normandy happened. And you know, the old cliche that no plan survives contact with the enemy is evident in the Normandy campaign, because it didn't go according to the plan, whatever you accept the plan to have been. And so my very clever notion, hardly original, is that what we get in the narrative is not necessarily what happened, but it's a response to, if you like, thesis, antithesis, synthesis. It's like this is how it was supposed to go. This is how it went. That wasn't right. So here's the narrative. So they had expectations. It didn't go that way, and then they reconciled the difference between the two in the narrative that came out after the war, which is actually not the way historians are supposed to work. So I tried to keep that in mind. So there were some key contemporary beliefs that have proven to be remarkably durable, particularly in popular culture, that the British never wanted to land in France. They just were so traumatized by the Somme and by 30 that they just didn't want the casualties. There was a sense that that Normandy was going to be predominantly an American operation. This actually begins as early as December 1943, when somebody let slip in the a committee in Washington, I think it's the Armed Forces Committee, that 75% of the forces needed to liberate Northwest Europe are likely to be American. And that gets morphed into 75% of the forces that are going to land in France are likely to come from America. And it was reinforced in June of 1945 when Stimson said something about on the first anniversary of D-Day that 75% of the forces were American. Well, in fact, the expectation was that by May of 1945, 75% of the forces in Northwest Europe would likely be American. But the landings on D-Day were going to actually be slightly more British and Canadian than American. And then there's the third one is that ultimately this was an Anglo-American story. It's all about the big dogs and who did all the heavy lifting. And so you end up, I think, to a very considerable extent, I've often described it to my students, as a dialogue of the deaf. Anglo-Americans arguing about who did the most important things, and neither side really listening to the other and giving it much credence. And then the story actually then gets completely wrapped up in the power shift between the British Empire and the rising American hegemon. This is fueled in large part, and as I began to dig, I began looking for the origins of the expectation of how Normandy was supposed to go down. A key role by the media. And we often think today of the internet and how quickly information moves around the world, but it's astonishing how quickly information moved around the world in the Second World War. By the 1930s, and I spend a little bit of time in the book talking about this, we have international shortwave radio broadcasts. You can talk to anybody in the world at almost any time, as long as they have a shortwave set, and it happens. German broadcasts into the United States start in the late 1920s, and Hitler picks them up, and there's a regular Shortwave broadcast. The Brits are a little slow. They start in the late 1930s broadcasting into America. Radio America gets off to a fairly slow start, but it's interesting that by the Second World War, we actually have a global system of communications that broadcasts into your home through your radio, not through your laptop. But anyway, the information gets there. Um, it moves by cable. It moves through the ether back and forth to newspapers. Some of the newspaper reporting and the movement of information from Europe back to North America and into the print is much, much less than 24 hours. It's almost instantaneous. You get the story at 11 o'clock at night. You set the type in by 6 o'clock in the morning. The newspapers are on the stand and you can read about what happened yesterday afternoon in Europe. So it's a fairly fast moving media environment, and it moves across the lines. It moves back and forth between the Allies and the Germans. It moves from Sweden into Germany. It's said that every day an aircraft from Britain would arrive at Lisbon and an aircraft from Germany would arrive at Lisbon, and they would taxi onto the tarmac. And they would park back to back, and the German papers would come off and be chucked into the British aircraft, and the British papers would come off and be chucked into the German aircraft. And then they would take off and carry their respective stories back to their national capitals. So the press is an important element, and both Britain and the United States begin to issue press guidance. This is particularly true in 1942 when America is finally in the war and the Office of War Information gets up and going. And there's a routine issue of how to spin the stories today. What the meaning of this story is this week. This is how you will explain what's going on to your readers. I know it hits the press. I can't track how effectively it hit the radio, and there's about 952 independent radio stations in the United States, so it's pretty hard to track. The British situation is much easier. Of course, there's the BBC, and that's pretty much it. But there is actually a fairly unified press guidance system in 1942 and 1943, particularly with the Office of War Information's Foreign Service, which operates out of Britain. And they conclude that that office will cover Europe, and there'll be an office to cover the Far East, and the Americans will run that. And the Allies will try to basically tell the same story and spin the press in the same way. And I track all that in the book. The unfortunate part, and somebody who's going to have to grab this nettle and deal with it, is that breaks down in early 1944. Partly because the Office of War Information is seen by the Republicans in the states as a tool of FDR's Democrats and his New Deal campaign. And in truth, the Office of War Information people, if the documents are to be believed, are predominantly Democrats and New Dealers, as opposed to the OSS, who are more Republican, more interested in not spinning the news, but actually spreading black information that may not actually be true. And I don't say that in a pejorative way. So OWI, which gets defunded very largely by Congress in December of 1943, becomes an instrument for championing America's war effort in 1943, and in particular, trying to ensure that Roosevelt gets reelected for a fourth term. So there's an information breakdown, and the American information system, which however briefly was kind of joint and allied, becomes very partisan and very American. The British, as it turns out, and somebody again will have to track this because there's very little on it. The British Ministry of Information seems to be blithely uninterested in persuading Americans of anything. I said in the book that the primary focus of British propaganda overseas is within the empire. The objective is to try to keep India and Canada and Australia and South Africa and all the elements of the empire together, so that when the war ends, Britain will be still a great power. And so their focus is predominantly on efforts, I think, within the British Empire and Commonwealth to keep the family together. And despite efforts by several people over the course of the war, including Lord Halifax, who becomes the ambassador after Lothian dies, to get Ministry of Information, to launch an effective campaign In the United States, the Ministry of Information, first off, is forbidden to do it by American law. And there is actual legislation passed in early 42 that says if you're going to speak positively on behalf of the British Empire, you have to register as a foreign agent. I think it's the Foreign Agent Review Act, is what it's called, the FAIR. It's discussed in the book. So the British actually have virtually no PR campaign in the United States at all. And the British military really doesn't want reporters too close to the front and reporting too accurately. So there's a colossal failure in British public relations. So if you're thinking about a battle for legacy, and if the media is the first draft of history, the US wins hands down. And they do that really rather effectively in Normandy. George Marshall was never very happy with the reporting coming out of the Mediterranean, because the reporting all went to London first, and then it was rebroadcast or resubmitted to Washington, and he felt the British were acting as a filter. So he didn't want the Normandy campaign to operate that way, and he wanted American reporting from Normandy and from France and Northwest Europe to go direct to the States. And there was a plan to manage information jointly, to share it and all that kind of stuff. And then at about 2 weeks in, both sides, British and the American sides, were going to be allowed to erect a giant, I think it's 40 kilowatt transmitter that would allow the U.S. Army in particular to broadcast directly back to the States without having to go to London for rebroadcast by the BBC. And it turns out that the U.S. Army brought that transmitter over early and had it erected by the 14th of June, and there was a major investigation done by SHAEF PR, which is actually led by Ernest Dupuy, into what is this thing? Why is it broadcasting? The information on what was going on in Normandy was getting back to New York faster than it was getting back to SHAEF headquarters in Portsmouth. And it had to do a major investigation. And it turns out that they had actually brought this huge transmitter in and were just blasting news reports back to New York by the carload. It was all done by teletype, sending tens of thousands of words a day. And in the end, they just had to let it go. So the U.S. Army actually sidesteps the press plan for Normandy and just acts on its own and starts sending information back. The long and short of it, and the book argues, is that the United States won the public relations war over Normandy hands down. Partly because the Brits still had this rather arcane system where every reporter had to go to the front with an officer escort and a driver in a designated vehicle. And the American system was more freeform. You're all here. If you can get there and get back and follow your story, good luck. It was all cleared by censors, but the long and short of it is if you were an American reporter, you could report almost anything. If you were a British reporter, you often had a hard time getting to the front. So the Brits actually lose the public relations battle. And this begins to matter late in the war when, after the American breakout at Cobra, and Robert McCormick of the Chicago Tribune, but even Bradley himself begins to claim that the victory in Europe is all American. He even gives a press conference where he says, the breakout, British had nothing to do with the breakout. Montgomery had absolutely nothing to do with the breakout. The British have just been passive since they landed on D-Day. The breakout was planned by Americans, executed by Americans, and so ultimately by the fourth week of August, the victory in Normandy is all American. The British response that they fought and held the bulk of the German army in place, particularly the Panzer formation, seems to be special pleading at the end, although I have to say that modern American historians like Rick Atkinson, Alan Millett, Croswell, have all debunked that notion and supported Montgomery's case pretty thoroughly. But the popular view is pretty much that the victory in Normandy was largely American. And I've seen it on the ground, at least in terms of overwhelming belief is often that liberation comes from a guy in a pod helmet. When I was there in 2014 on the anniversary of the liberation, virtually all the iconography that the French had created for celebration along the beaches and in Normandy had an American soldier as the liberator. And most recently, they've developed a route around the Falaise Gap to celebrate the destruction of the German army in the Falaise Gap. And the iconography used in that one is American soldiers. And part of this is driven by tourism. So, the modern tourism thing is giving a spin. The new film in that rotunda that's up from Arromanches is largely American film footage. Tragedy for Canada is that virtually all of our film footage disappeared in a massive silver nitrate explosion in Montreal in a warehouse in 1965. And so in an age of digital imagery and visual stuff and videos, we have virtually nothing to put up. Beyond footage that just gets recycled. So let me just, what gets lost in all of this? And I know this sounds like special pleading to many people, but what gets lost in all of this is the role of the little Canadian army in the whole process. And arguably the role of Canada in general in contributions to the war, whether it's the Battle of the Atlantic in industrial production, the air war. But in the case of the Army, which never is larger overseas than about 6 divisions, 5 actual divisions and a couple of armored brigades, its role is actually surprisingly important. And I tried to point that out. And I did argue in the book that it's been smothered, and I'll come back to that. The gist of that is the legacy of the Great War. And I started the book, as those of you who read it will know, by discussing the Great War, because everybody argues about who won it. The Brits claim that they did. The Americans claim that they did. The French might have some claim, although they're pretty weak by 1918. But even the Canadian Corps, 100,000 man pocket army, it was not shy about making claims after the war that they did much of the heavy lifting. 100,000 men in the Canadian Army took on and defeated 47 German divisions in the 100 Days campaign and captured X number of guns, etc. And in fact, if you look at the two claims between the American Expeditionary Force, which is 1 million men, and the Canadian claim of 100,000 men doing the same kind of job, the American claims are about the same, about 47 divisions, same number of guns, same number of machine guns. So it's a spurious argument. America's contribution in 1918 was unquestionably important. If you're a German and you cut your way through the manpower of 2 or 3 or 4 major empires, then all of a sudden America lands in your lap, it's got to be devastating. Doesn't mean that the Pershing's campaign was singularly decisive, but the presence of the American army was, I think. Anyway, so they argue about that. But the Canadian Corps was the shock army of the British Army, British Expeditionary Force in 1918, and that legacy carries on because the Germans believe it and the Germans know it and understand it. So when the Canadian Army is reformed in England and finally begins to grow to a decent size by 1942, and becomes McNaughton's dagger, named after Andy McNaughton, who's the Army commander. Often dismissed as kind of a silly concept, but it fits the British idea that the landing in France and the attack on Germany is going to come after the Germans are effectively defeated and the shoddy edifices of fascism are collapsing all around them. And then you land small, highly mechanized, fast, mobile force that will gather people around it as it drives to Berlin. It's kind of like FOCO theory, right? It's like the way Castro took Cuba. You just march on the capital and hope people will rally around you. So McNaughton's dagger then becomes a key part of the Cossack planning in 1943. And a lot of these gunners, including Freddie Morgan, had actually served in the Canadian Corps in the First World War. So for that matter, had Allenbrook. And so McNaughton's little army becomes a key component of the planning for the landings in France. And in fact, if you believe the last plan made by Freddie Morgan's Cossack staff up to the end of 1943, The landings in France will be conducted by 1st U.S. Army and 1st Canadian Army, with 2nd British Army as a follow-on formation sometime later in the campaign. So Canada's going to play an important role. And then, for a number of reasons, none of them, I think, really rather good, not the least of which is that almost everybody in the Canadian Army hates Andy McNaughton. It seems all the professional soldiers do. And he's seen as obstructionist and preventing the Canadian Army from getting combat experience in Italy. The government decides to send half the Canadian Army to Italy. McNaughton gets the boot, and you end up with 1st Canadian Army, which actually has no commanding officer and is only half Canadian. And I don't think it would have survived the arrival of Montgomery anyway, because I think the idea of the British playing, a tertiary role in the D-Day operations would be an absurd notion to Montgomery and probably to the British government too. So two things actually survived from that fiasco in 1943. One is the legacy of 1st Canadian Army as the lead horse in the real landing in France, not the deception, not the secondary landing that's going to take place in Normandy, but the real critical landing that's going to take place in the Pas-de-Calais. That's going to be done by 1st Canadian Army, as was always planned. And 3rd Canadian Division is going to go to Normandy loaded for bear with the most firepower of any division to land on D-Day. And its job is going to be to kill the Panzer counterattack. And so one of the unique contributions, I made it in Stopping the Panzers, and it's the account's slightly revised in Second Front, is the defeat of the Panzer counterattack. Those of you who are familiar with the Second World War, we know that every major Allied landing on the continent of Europe up to this point has been struck by an armored counterattack, whether it's the counterattack at Gela in Sicily, or the one at Salerno, or the one at Anzio, which was the biggest operation in the West since 1940. The expectation was that there would be a staggeringly large Panzer counterattack on any landing in France. And in fact, the Germans tried to pull that off. And it stopped in two ways. It stopped by hard fighting by 3rd Canadian Division on the ground, because they've come prepared to do that, on the ground that Cossack has identified, and incidentally on the same ground that Rommel has identified as the key ground for the Panzer counterattack. And it stopped because the deception operation, of which 1st Canadian Army is a key component, holds the Germans not only in the Pas-de-Calais, but redirects Panzer reinforcements on the 9th of June from Normandy to the Pas-de-Calais. And if you believe the American historian T.L. Cubbage, who went back in the archives and assessed all of this deception material, that deception, which was the newspaper accounts in the New York Times, Chicago Tribune, the Toronto Globe and Mail, the London Times, all say that the landing would be conducted by specially trained Canadian troops. That changed the course of history. And we can talk about this, but George Patton didn't have anything to do with it. I need to get to the bottom of where that myth of Patton comes from, but Patton becomes critical to Operation Fortitude South 2 after he is confirmed as the commanding officer of FUSAG on the 12th of June. But up to that point, it's really all about the Canadians, I think, and I made that point in the book. So there's a couple of other places where the Canadians make a big difference. I did argue that it's the Canadians who hold the line while the U.S. Army is getting geared up for Cobra. Cobra was supposed to launch on the 18th of July, but there wasn't enough ammunition. And we should probably talk about this a little bit maybe, but the logistics histories of the U.S. Army for that period were written and published in the 1990s, long after the operational accounts were published 30 years before. But there's a serious ammunition shortage in the U.S. Army, which affects the actual conduct of operations. And so for a period of about 4 days, 2nd Canadian Corps sacrifices itself up on Verrier Ridge, holding German panzer forces in place so that when Cobra does finally launch on the 25th of July, there's almost nobody in front of it. But Canada pays quite a staggering price in casualties to achieve that. It's Operation Totalized, which is launched on the 8th of the evening of the 7th and the 8th of August, 1944, which confirms for the Germans that they can't renew the Mortain counteroffensive and they got to get out, so that a renewed wave of attacks doesn't strike the American army around Mortain. And then ultimately, it's the Canadian army that gets stuck in the Falaise Gap along the Dives River. And I'm still haunted by my father's comment to me as a professional historian, which I couldn't answer until this book was published. If closing the Falaise Gap was so friggin' important, how come the only people down there trying to do it were us and the Poles? And it appears it wasn't important. Montgomery wasn't prepared to close it. Bradley wasn't prepared to close it. They were just prepared to let the Canadians and the Poles, as the Brits would say, take the bowling and shred as many German formations as they possibly could. My father's artillery regiment was firing from two um, um, plotting boards with batteries back to back, firing in all directions, I think on an arc of 280 degrees. In the Falaise Gap, there was no shortage of targets, and I found his gun position the last time I was in Normandy. It's a spectacular spot. You can see it all, and there are Germans everywhere. Anyway, based on all this, I think Second Front makes a case for a new narrative of the Normandy campaign, and I tried to actually present that. I'm going to try to sharpen it up maybe at some point, and how our understanding of the events and the development of that original narrative were shaped by contemporary political and personality problems. So I better leave it there. I'm already, I think, well out to beyond my 30 minutes. So thanks very much for your attention, and I'm happy to entertain questions.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Mark. That was great. Jim, it looks like you're first in the queue. So if you want to unmute your line and ask your question, we should be good to go.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes,
Yeah.
I can, Jim. Yeah.
Hey, how you doing, Mark? Haven't seen you in a long time.
Yeah, I know. I've been
You've been
retired
up
and
there in
grumpy.
Canada, man. Yeah, it was really interesting to listen to your talk. I look forward to reading your book, and I was listening to it. I was thinking of all the different comments I was going to throw at you, just ideas that came up listening. Because I used to talk to Carlo a lot about this when he was
Yes.
still Carlo Desti, and I just want to make a number of points and comments, just sort of stream of consciousness as I'm listening to you. Uh, Years ago, I tracked down Gordon Harrison. He was retired and living up in New England someplace. Bloomington was difficult to deal with because he always wanted money if you had to talk to him. Of course, he did some great work. Harrison was very reluctant to talk about his Green Book.
Hmm.
He actually put it down. It was very interesting to me. He sort of minimized what he had done. And it raises the question of how we look at Cornelius Ryan, because Cornelius Ryan, to me, was the most well-funded military historian after World War II, bar none, because he got all that money from the Reader's Digest. Now, you mentioned McCormick earlier,
Yes.
and the Chicago newspapers. And McCormick, of course, is associated with the America First movement before the war.
Yep.
He is also associated with sponsoring McCarthyism after the war. And during the war, there was that famous story where he was asked to not publish, different accounts that would jeopardize his operational security. So McCormick raises another question about how during the war, the rise of the Republican Party, recovery of the Republican Party after Pearl Harbor, how that impacts on second front issues. And then the media said, now I would tend to differ with you on this question of the British not having an impact, because remember, there was all those investigations before Pearl Harbor about Hollywood, and they were very concerned about, the movies coming out like Mrs. Miniver, things like that.
Yep.
And you get into this whole question of what the Brits were doing with their MI6 operations and influencing opinion. But anyway, that we can agree to disagree. Now, years ago, I had as a professor Chester Wilmot's researcher, Graham Irwin, who was a student at Oxford, and well, he was married to Wilmot's sister. And I asked Graham, well, how did Chester come up with this book? Because as you recall, part of what we're arguing about is the kind of arguments that happened after the war when they were having these big debates about the very issues you talk about Normandy. who's responsible. And Monty's getting pilloried by the Americans, and Chester's pillorying the Americans. And Graham was very interesting in the sense that he was right in the thick of doing that research. And he sort of gave me the impression from all that he was having that Chester was sort of very much influenced by, he was a great correspondent for the BBC, and he was basically relating and siphoning some of the hostility that he got from Monty in the research he was doing. Anyway, but that was an amazing thing. Graham Irwin worked with him, but really interesting stuff to listen to. I'm just sort of curious about your comments. I didn't know your dad was in that division. Thanks, man.
Just a couple of quick comments. Yeah, almost everything you raise is actually in the book
Okay, cool.
in one form or another. The book comes out to 656 pages of text, and it's half the size of my manuscript. I couldn't get, no one wants to publish 500,000 words. So a lot of it ended up on the cutting room floor, but there's a lot in there on the British. Oh, geez, what's that? The thing that William Stevenson ran
Yeah,
on efforts to try to deflect America First movement.
Anthony Cave Brown stuff. Yeah.
Yep. So you'll have to read it, and then at some point maybe we'll have to get together and have a chat about it. I think, by the way, that I'm the more I read Harrison, the more impressed I am with him. That's a marvelously reflective book. I haven't gone through the American operational documents, but his kind of contextual reflections on how things are going down, I think is just outstanding. And I knew Martin Blumenson quite well. You'll see a reference to him in.
Oh, okay.
He was a regular, actually coming up to New Brunswick when Toby Graham ran the program, and he was here running in a seminar the night that I heard from Ottawa that I too was going to be an official historian. So we were able to have a drink. And then one of my first jobs as an official historian in Ottawa was to take the drafts of his Breakout and Pursuit and put them through the shredder.
Wow.
And when the archivist came in, he looked at me and he said, these are governed by the Official Secrets Act. And if they turn up in your office or in your home at some point, you could be looking for another job. So I told Martin afterwards that I shredded his draft, but there were virtually no notes on it. I later found a long memorandum on foolscap paper in Charles Stacey's personal papers at the University of Toronto, page by page commentary on that draft. And
yeah, the last comment I'd make is that Forrest Pogue was very, very helpful. He was the guy who turned me on to all these Green Book historians. Anyway, we'll do something soon.
Yeah, okay.
But thank you.
Thanks, Jim. Charles asked, did anyone from Canada fight in North Africa?
Not as a formation. Canadians sent out drafts, not even drafts. They sent out junior officers, some senior officers, sergeants to get combat experience. The only Canadian presence in North Africa officially were RCAF squadrons, medium bomber squadrons, Wellington squadrons. So we didn't have a Canadian presence in North Africa.
Great. Hal asked, Mark, great to see you. Great talk. How's retirement going?
Great, because you don't have to go to meetings and write stupid memos. It's perfect.
I can understand that. Mike, I'll turn over to you. I know you had a question. So if you want to unmute your line and ask your question.
Yeah. Great talk, Mark. And you probably could have gone an hour and a half longer. But full disclosure, of course, I've been writing a trilogy of plays, actually, revolving around the Canadian activities in Normandy for the first few days after D-Day, and in particular about the murders that were committed of Canadian prisoners that were taken during the defense of the beachhead.
Yes, I recall you were working on, what's his name from the Royal Winnipeg Rifles with the great mustaches?
Yes, Lockie Fulton. Yeah,
Lockie Fulton, yeah.
Dear friend, yes. Rest in peace. And yes, and of course I've been on the, because of that, I've been on the grounds many times, including where your dad landed, I believe, with the 13th Field Regiment.
Yes.
And yeah, so anyway, given that, I'd probably be the last person you'd have to convince of the disproportionately large and important contribution of the Canadians to the success of D-Day, and particularly to the defense of the beachhead, the D-Day beachhead, up until the point, especially up until the point when the beachheads were all linked up.
Yeah.
Which is crucial. So given that, I really have two questions, which I usually do, sorry. But one, do you think that to what degree post-war, well, or during the war, I mean, in other words, the dissemination of information had to do with morale of the particular countries, making sure that you know, everybody on the home front was behind them, etc. But and a little bit to kind of a form of American exceptionalism, because if you look at in the media, if you look at films or something like that, it's almost as if 90% of the forces that landed were American, and in how that played out in the consciousness of the world, then of course telling Americans that it was them that did most everything, and then of course Hollywood or whatever would
Yep.
disseminate that to the rest of the world. So I was wondering about your feelings about, or your comments about that. Also, about problems within, not necessarily between the different allied nations, but within the allied nations, within the allied camps. For instance, there was a big there was no love lost between Montgomery and Rod Keller, the commander of the 3rd Canadian Division. So I was wondering how you thought that would played out in the actual activities.
Two things. There's some stuff in the book on newsreel footage, and they made an effort to ensure that the newsreel footage was released simultaneously in North America and in the UK. Excuse me, that it was reasonably balanced, but in the end, it didn't work out that way. The British office, the British Information Service in New York, which incidentally produced an unbelievable regular reporting on the American media that ran to dozens of pages every week, reporting on every pertinent story in American news magazines. And then about every 2 weeks, it ran a summary of a foreign language press in the United States, as well as a commentary on newsreels appearing in American theaters. Was complaining as early as, I think it's the 12th of June. You have to check the book. I probably got this wrong. Maybe it's the 21st. That if you sat in an American theater and watched newsreels, you would think the only people who invaded Europe were Americans. With a few Brits, Commonwealth soldiers, they said, for color. So somehow Paith and the newsreel companies managed to get that footage back without it being kind of pooled and censored, if you like, and produce newsreels. And they would have that showed overwhelmingly American soldiers doing things. Now, I have to say that the Office of War Information produced a series of newsreels, which you can actually buy. I don't know if you can still do it, but I bought it years ago as a CD set, that were on average about 6 weeks in arrears of events. So if you watch those newsreels for D-Day, you'd be getting them in early July, and they are quite balanced, but they're not the immediate news. And you'll find in the book there's references to the frequency, the dependency that American people had on newsreel footage. That was their TV footage, and what they saw were predominantly American troops. But that goes back, I mean, the idea that there's only Americans fighting is not limited to the newsreel footage. You'll find some evidence in there from some of the surveys that were done in 1942, even among American troops in Iraq and Iran, building railroads and carrying goods to the Russians, who said the people who are doing most of the fighting are the Russians, then it's the Americans, and then it's everybody else, and then there's some Brits fighting somewhere. We're not quite sure where. So there is that perception among Americans fairly early on, and the Brits don't do much. The book talks about this. The Brits don't do much to address that. The Germans are much, much better at getting the news stories out, getting photographs to American papers, particularly in the period before America enters the war. In terms of morale, it's noticed in Canada, and one of the things that slipped in the book, and they did all the work on it, but was the Canadian reaction at home to news coverage. And one of the things that's rather unique about Canada's coverage of its own war effort by its own correspondents is that it was very comprehensive. We had a dog in every fight, which meant that we had a reporter just about everywhere. And we had, excuse me, our own newsreel coverage coming back. So Canadians could get the Associated Press and the UP stories. We would get Paith and Movie Tune and all the other newsreels. But we also got extensive coverage of our own people doing stuff in the air, on the ground, and at sea by Canadian reporters. So it was a kind of I probably should have put it in there. It's kind of like a non-story. We're good. But there is a perception, particularly from the newsreel footage, that the bias is pretty sharply towards the United States.
Right. And as far as the rivalries, let's say, between Montgomery, whose plan actually.
Yeah. Listen, one of the things I needed to say, because the book is a bit of a bummer, right? Because it's all about the Americans and the Brits fighting and Canadians fighting each other and all that kind of stuff. Beyond interpersonal problems like Montgomery, and I don't think even Montgomery and Patton had a serious interpersonal problems. They were both sons of bitches and they knew it. And they're both glory hounds and they knew it. And if you believe Martin Blumenson, they would have been better paired than Montgomery and Bradley. But if you'd ask people like my father, and you could probably find it among American troops, if they thought they had a problem, with the Canadians being slackers or the Brits being slackers, I don't think so. I don't think so. My father often reminded me that he had enormous respect for any man who had to fight in Normandy, and I think he extended that to all the Germans, with the possible exception of the SS, 12th SS. So at a certain level, it works fine. My book picks up on the bitching and the griping at the political and higher command level, where it's bound to happen. It's bound to happen in any major campaign. And maybe it's overstated, but the important thing to remember is, they got it done, and the average Joe on the ground got along with the guy he was working with.
Right. Do you think, by the way, the weather, which was not far from ideal, it was acceptable, but far from ideal, had a lot to do with the change of plans?
Well, the weather certainly allowed the Germans to move with a level of impunity that they might not otherwise have done. Right. There's long periods where American aircraft don't get off the ground. There's no airstrikes, and the U.S. Army is pretty heavily dependent on tactical air support. Eisenhower certainly complains about this. The Great Storm, which not only set the Allies back, and I recount this in the book, it was an enormous boon for the Germans, just a real boost, because they could move and did move troops and equipment and supplies with impunity for about 4 days. So yes, the weather has an impact. It has an impact certainly on the rate at which stuff's coming across the beach, not just during the Great Storm, but in the first couple of days too. It's pretty hard going. The Allies land on the 6th of June. The 7th of June, the weather's actually worse, as I recollect. Real trouble getting the anti-tank regiments ashore on the Canadian beaches, which they really were relying on when the Panzer counterattack came. It takes them a long time to get them ashore. So yeah, weather certainly, it seems to play to the German hand better than ours.
Right. But it was still a Canadian success, and thank God for it. Thank you, Mark.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. Tom, if you want to unmute your line, TMH, and ask your question.
Still muted, Tom.
TMH, iPad 4, not sure. Okay, maybe we'll go to Gary. Gary, if you want to unmute your line and ask your question.
Am I unmuted?
Yes, you are. You're good.
Okay, now I think we have two people. Tom, why don't you go first, and then Gary, I'll circle back to you.
Well, I haven't seen Marc Milner for 10 years when I interrupted a lunch he was having in the Caen Memorial with the dentist, Dr. Benimou.
Oh, yes.
I spent quite a bit of time in Normandy since 1985 until my last trip in April and May. On two occasions, Martin Blumenson and I lived in Saint-Aubin for 2 to 3 months while teaching University of Texas students.
Wow.
I want to point out that Martin, the great protagonist for George Patton, gave Montgomery considerable credit for Operation Cobra, and not in the usual sense of holding the German army armor around Caen. But from Martin's point of view, Bradley became, of course, greatly depressed within a month after D-Day, 40,000 American casualties with an average gain of only about 8 miles all across the front. And he didn't know what to do, went to see Montgomery to ask Montgomery's advice. And in Martin's telling, that Montgomery put his 2 fingers on the map for the road west of Saint-Lô, between Saint-Lô and Perrier, and said he thought this was the vulnerable place where the full force should be gathered to punch through the German defensive lines that would be on the road west of Saint-Lô. And then Bradley took that to heart, and that became Operation Cobra. And I would say also that Martin also gave recognition in numerous writings and in his teaching that of the Allied nations on D-Day, Canada put forth the greatest effort in proportion to its population and then known resources. So,
Yeah, it's interesting what you say.
I would like to ask you.
Okay,
Go ahead.
sorry. Go ahead, Tom.
Yeah. Well, I would only conclude with a question. I'd go all the way back to Dieppe, and of course we know that the Canadians were the major force in the landing force. But what role did the Canadians have in the decision to go for it?
To the best of my knowledge, the only role the Canadians had in any serious planning about Dieppe was to volunteer to do it. They didn't select the site. They were virtually excluded, as I understand it, from most of the operational and tactical planning. Their job was to get in the boat and go. And after the fact, historians have subsequently concluded that the person who pushed the hardest for all this was Harry Crerar. And because the Canadians needed to get in the fight in 1942. And you know, my book does wrestle with, you know, Canada's a democracy too, and the country needs to be seen to be fighting. And Canadians did not identify with the air war over Germany or over France. And in 42, we're only just really getting involved in the bomber campaign. And they certainly did not identify with the war at sea in the North Atlantic. It had to be done, but for Canadians, fighting Germans meant going to Europe and getting on the ground and duking it out with them. So there was a lot of pressure, and there was pressure again in 43, which is why we sent half the army to Italy. I should say before going up, when you were doing all that with Martin Blumenson, he was, as I mentioned, a frequent visitor to the University of New Brunswick, and he and Toby Graham went over this stuff continuously in my graduate seminar and over drinks and over dinner, and I was fortunate to be part of that. So Toby was a great obvious proponent of Montgomery and Miles Dempsey and the British Army. So Martin would have gotten a great deal of pretty direct challenge and questioning from Toby Graham. They're kind of an odd couple, a 6'4", hawk-nosed, skinny, rather aggressive Brit, and the diminutive Martin Blumenson, and it was an interesting couple to watch.
Hey, thanks a lot, Tom. Gary, if you want to unmute your line and ask your question. Okay.
Hello?
Yep, there we
Yep.
go.
Okay, I'm sorry, I'm in a bad spot here, so hopefully I don't break up too badly. Thank you for a great talk. I have to apologize. Usually I try to download these if they're downloadable and read these books or get a good portion of them under my view before these talks. So I just had very little time to go over your book, but from what I saw, I really liked. I would have to add to what you said about some of the recent American historians that highlighted the role of the British Canadian Army holding down the German armor during the opening phase of Overlord. Stephen Zillow.
Yes.
Also,
Yeah.
interesting way. And matter of fact,
I was in pretty regular contact with Steve during the writing of this book. So, and curiously enough, to give you some idea of the scope of the book, at one point I had 2 books on order from Amazon: Steve Zalaga's History of American Anti-Tank Guns, and a short primer on Keynesian economics, which I desperately needed since I wasn't very up to speed on Lord Keynes. So it's an odd mix, and a lot of that link between, if you like, the larger socioeconomic, political, psychological picture, and what happened on the ground ended up being cut from the book when it was finally published. But there is some stuff there on Bretton Woods, so I tried to tie anti-tank guns together with Bretton Woods, and you'll have to let me know whether that was successful.
Great. I think that's all we have in the queue. Mark, thanks again for a great talk and Q&A. Again, the book is Second Front, Anglo-American Rivalry and the Hidden Story of the Normandy Campaign by Marc Milner. Please join us next Saturday, January 24th at 1 p.m. when historian Joe Mollison will discuss his book, Air Battles Before D-Day, How Allied Airmen Crippled the Luftwaffe and German Army in France, which reveals how a year of strategic bombing and aerial warfare created the conditions necessary for D-Day's success. Thank you for joining us this afternoon, and we look forward to next week. Mark, thank you so much for a great talk.
My pleasure. Thank you for the opportunity.
Take care.
Great job again, Mark. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great.